old-fashioned, the television is offline right now image.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Experiencing technical.
Or even just, you know, the sort of the rainbow bars or the...
A beep, an annoying beep. Well, I was wondering if you all would be willing to share a little bit about if or if not, faith has been a part of your trans experience in any way. And we'll start with Ashley because you're on the other end now.
Yeah, it's definitely a part of my faith. I mean, the reason I knew that I was gender conflicted at the age of 4, and I began to have a real serious problem and repressing that when I was young. And so the whole thing that kept me from dealing with it, looking at it, was the religious beliefs my parents had. So for me, once I realized that I was trans and that I couldn't unring that bell that I was going to transition, I had to figure out a way to reconcile that with my faith. And so in the very first days, I was trying to figure out where I could be in relationship with Jesus around that transition. So. And then, ironically, it led me into ministry. So it's something I would never thought I would do. So
I'm still formulating.
Okay.
Okay. So for me, I am personally agnostic, but I found in my life that kind of faith and transness are interrelated in actually 2 different ways that kind of go back and forth. So I was raised Catholic, and I had, as I was kind of coming to terms with myself being trans, I had a lot of the personal experiences that a lot of people who come from religions that are historically not as welcoming, or at least the institutional versions of one's queerness or transness. And so for me, that was kind of one of the reasons why I initially basically became an atheist, which I don't identify as now. And part of it was coming from a lot of different things. It was, you know, growing up in some intellectual ideas, but some of it was a feeling of not belonging, and that kind of turned me away from religion. And so for a while I became a really kind of obnoxious atheist when I was, you know, like late teens, early 20s, and kind of had the attitude that humans tend to have, where we assume that whatever it is that we believe is the right way, and people who don't believe like us must be brainwashed or duped, or they're just, you know. And that was kind of my thinking at the time, except that I kept coming across people in my life who were very smart and intelligent and independent and critical thinkers who were people of faith. And for me, this posed a contradiction in my head of trying to make sense of that. And one of the things that was really helpful for me actually was my experiences as a trans person, because I'm like, well, hey, I'm having these experiences that I know most people out in the world won't believe. You know, the idea that I had some kind of feeling that I knew I should be female, even though I was assigned a male sex at birth. And to a lot of people in the world, that doesn't make any sense to them, and they will assume that they're right and that they're superior and that I must be delusional. And so I found that my transness was actually really helpful for me to just recognize that, hey, other people are experiencing things that I'm not experiencing right now, and that's good. So.
Faith had a lot to do with my transitioning, especially in the latter part. I grew up Catholic, and I remember I was always felt conflicted about my gender. There was always some confusion about that. And I remember when I was a kid, I was playing with my friend Arthur, and Arthur needed to use the bathroom, and so he just did what guys do. And I thought to myself, well, does it grow out? You know, I just was really confused, and continued to stay confused until I came out as a lesbian. Where I lived on Long Island, there was the only people that you came out to were lesbian separatists.
Hmm.
And they did not like men, and they did not like trans men, but that's where I came out, and they were the original anti-penis. And so I remember being in the bar one night with them, and there was this female to male trans person there, and I was like, oh my God, you can do that? I mean, this is like a long time ago, okay? This is like early 80s, you know, late 70s, and stuff. I didn't know you could do that. And that always stayed in the back of my mind, you know? And it wasn't until much later, till I was in my 40s, where I really started to feel like I needed to make this change. And I had already made peace with my faith in my recovery from alcoholism. But I knew that when I started to go on this journey that I was going to need to really hold on tight, because this wasn't like anything I was ever had encountered before. And it's been an interesting journey, especially in the past few years, where I've really had to do some very deep work with God and who I am, and how that fits in with ministry and everything else, and how ministry fits in with that, because a lot of people think, well, you're trans, you can't be a Christian. I'm like, oh yeah? Watch me. And I've actually lost more people for becoming a Christian than I have for being trans. So go figure.
I'm still not, something isn't formulating in a concrete way in how to respond to the question. There's so many different thoughts.
Do you want to talk about the Tao of transition?
Well, a couple of things that came to my mind had to do with, I entered seminary as an agnostic. I left as a non-theist. There's seems to be no difference, but it's more than semantical, the difference. And part of what I learned to do before going to seminary as being a member of the separatist lesbian community and attending MCC Church was how to talk about God without pronouns, right? So that was sort of my introduction to non-gendering or ungendering or gender flattening in language. And so I use that reference sometimes when people ask me why it is so easy for me to switch pronouns with people or go back and forth on pronouns with people. And I say, well, try talking about God without using he. And people look at me like that's strange, and I'm like, just, if once I mastered that, talking to and about trans people became simple. Like that's the only concrete reference that I can give to like my transness and religion, because I feel like I worked through most of my issues and resistances with religion in my 20-something years in lesbian community. That once I came out of that, and I was also no longer referring to myself as an atheist and not really being one, but it was just because I was angry at the way people were standing at the pride parades with Turner Burn signs. That it's simultaneously leaving lesbian community and the anger behind, I entered seminary and started transitioning, not medically. So it's sort of, they coincided. So it's hard for me to tie it directly to it, but it seems to be part of it. I think I could spend a lot of time thinking about it and say more later. The Tao of Transition that Megan referenced is a blog that I started in 2007. I think I only wrote 3 or 4 entries, which is pretty customary for blogs. And what I did was I read a lot about Taoism, because that's a system that was prevalent in my father's home growing up. And so I took some of the concepts from Taoism and applied them to my own transition, using some of the philosophical concepts there. So I think it's on Blog Post or something.
Blogspot.
Blogspot, yeah. So it's Tao of Transition. And I've thought about picking it back up again. I thought about using it in some other ways. But it was recently picked up and reblogged by a gender therapist in Phoenix, and it got a lot of good comments there. So somehow people like that, and it's on that Trans Faith Online website under the Taoism tab. So, yeah.
Part of what this conference is hoping to do for the student Christian movement is to come up maybe with a list of agenda items that people who are students can advocate for over the next year. And so part of what we're doing is trying to get feedback about issues that rise to the surface, and particularly thinking about the different ways that justice intersects with all the different parts of our lives and the different privileges and oppressions that we experience in different parts of our lives. If you were to lobby these group of leaders who are going to do the work over the coming years, of issues you'd like them to really take an interest in, what issues would you rise to the top? And I say whoever has an idea first can talk, because it's a really long, not fair question for.
What's the context? Are we talking congregations, seminaries, communities, all of it?
Yeah, so historically, it's from the World Student Christian Federation, which is a global ecumenical movement.
Okay.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King, they're people. They're all been part of this, generating the student mentality of movement as opposed to basically working just out of communities, like isolating themselves. And so we're a network of different groups, but it is globally oriented. And so each global movement has a student Christian movement for like the United States, Canada, all over. And so the United States, we just come back. 2010 was our official relaunch. We voted ourselves out of existence in the 60s. We couldn't agree on civil rights. We couldn't agree on the Vietnam War. And it's just better if we don't exist. We're just going to agree to disagree. Our only agreement is we disband. So a group of students said, no, there's a gap. In that gap, we saw the rise of Campus Crusades. We saw the rise of InterVarsity, the rise of RUF. So we're trying to bring that progressively oriented Christianity back into the picture. That's what we're going for. And so it's a lot, but we are very much trying to find the appropriate stances for the transgender community and how we relate to everyone in the community. So, yeah.
Or you could kind of think of the question of, if you were your younger self, what would you want to put a lot of energy in if you had the opportunity? You know? Maybe you do also advocate for these issues, but like if you could get a cohort of 100 riled up college students to like put the energy in the world for you.
I would say trans healthcare, because I really feel that that's one thing is that we tend to, everybody looks at LGBT like it's a word, and it's not. It's different groups that live underneath there. And trans people particularly have things are a lot more complex. So going to the doctor is a complex thing. It can be very scary. And what happens, Kaiser does a really good job with it. But you still have to be careful that when you go to a doctor, even though they might be say that they're trans inclusive, really they're trans clueless, and they're a new doctor trying to build up their patient base. So you really have to ask the questions. And for some people, that's difficult, of even feeling like, why should I advocate for me in a system that really doesn't see me? So there's a problem. You have a lot of people who don't access healthcare for that reason, a lot of trans people. So I think it's really important, both on a social justice level and on a pastoral level, to kind of bring those two together. That we have to create a system of healthcare that is safe, and have people who are trans bring them back in and show them, take them literally by the hand, show them that this is okay. I'm going to sit with you through this, and you're going to be all right.
I would say one thing that I think piggybacks on that is, in just going through my head and thinking, there's such a humongous list of different things that I could go through, whether it's that and, problems like in the prison system, with regards to trans people and gender nonconforming people, or restrooms, or exclusion from certain spaces because they're gendered. And so much of it, all of those things have the one central idea that there's not any space for you if you don't really neatly fall into the binary. And as someone who's binary identified, identify fully as a woman, it still complicates the lives of trans people, whether we're binary identified, and then also the many non-binary identified or gender questioning or agender trans folks. Especially, I think a lot of those people are kind of not really being listened to, or there's not a lot of awareness about them in this, like, you know, transgender tipping point media phenomenon where like everything I read is about trans, and it's really mostly about trans women and trans men. And I think that it's great that people are increasingly being like, oh, okay, you know, you're transsexual, you can exist. Okay, I watch Orange is the New Black, so I'm okay with you. But without any kind of grand reimagining of the fact that, you know, we need more spaces in our society that are safe for people who, whether they're transitioned or non-binary identified people. And I think that that's at the root of a lot of the other problems that I could name and that we all could name here.
Well, so when I was at PSR, I was dating my wife, who will be here later on. And she likes to tell the story about how she was sitting in one of her classes. It was like how to build your congregation kind of class. I'm not even sure which one it was because the MDiv students had their own classes separate. I was in the theological program. And a question from a student to the professor was, how can we get more of insert those kind of people to come to our church? Right? How can we get more? So it's similar to like, how can we get trans people involved, or what can we do for trans people? And so, or about trans issues. And so the professor's response was, and it's sort of my response, which is, figure out where that group goes and just go there, right? So it's like, for me, the way to understand about trans people, work with trans people, and incorporate trans people into something is to literally just go to where the trans people are, instead of trying to find a way to invite them into your thing. To go and partner. So I'm this person, I'm with this organization, how can we serve you? Not what information can you provide to us so that we can do some, but it's more like how can we partner on things. So I would recommend or suggest ways to partner with trans community on things that have to do with justice, have to do with faith, have to do with community building. Because what I think what can happen is out of that, people can emerge as the bridge builders and develop a certain skill set to be able to walk and talk and move in both worlds. And we need more of those people. We need people who can walk and talk and move in both worlds, in all worlds, so that this us-them dichotomy can get broken down. And I think that's a gift that you can bring to the community.
I would really like to see gender addressed in the educational setting, and particularly the systemic sexism, and really begin to help teachers and administrators begin to look at bioessentialist thinking, you know, and the sexism that flows out of that, in particular, beginning to loosen people up so that they can think about people and help people feel safe by not insisting that, you know, that because their bodies are you know, a certain way, or even if they present a certain way, that doesn't necessarily follow that they're going to want certain things. To open up people's thinking so that people can be to exist on a spectrum, and that the educational institutions can help create ways for them to feel safe, whether it's around bathrooms and use of preferred names, preferred pronouns, all of those things. And because I think that by educating educators, they help create generations that will go out into the world and help alter the corporate systems and nonprofits to extend that kind of more open gendered perspective throughout our society. For me, even PSR struggles with that. It's still difficult to, they're very proud of saying that they're trans and queer affirming, but use of legal names and pronouns and things like that. And only last year did we, gender free bathrooms, for example. I think that having gender neutral bathrooms at educational institutions around the country would be a huge step. And I think it can open up dialogue around, people sharing space. So that's just one thought.
And I don't think I've asked this of any groups yet this weekend, but I feel kind of motivated to ask you guys. Is there anything you want people to stop helping with?
Stop helping with?
Stop helping with, like ways that people advocate in ways that are unhelpful or...
There's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot and talking about, and I think that there's this idea of when I meet people who are wanting to be, trans inclusive or trans aware, and I think that there's this mentality, people are like, oh, can you tell me about this? Can you teach me about this? And there's this assumption that there's this all this knowledge that I need to sit down with them and okay, these are all the things, these are all the words we use, these are all the roles, these are all the trans issues. And I feel like we're kind of, there's good that can come from that, but I also think that in some ways we're doing it backwards. Because the problem is that when we're born, we don't have any sense of gender. And what I mean is of who is male, who is female. That's all learned. We learn that through our first few years, where we're taught to put people into different boxes. And what happens is by the time we get to be adults, having lived through that system and having just absorbed all of these assumptions that we make about people based upon A, whether we perceive them as male or female, and B, the assumptions we put on top of that, oh, well, you're a man, so you must like this, and you're a woman, so you must not like that. And so I think that when people are like, oh, you have to teach me about this trans things, I'm like, actually what you have to do is stop and unlearn all of that, right? And especially, and a lot of it comes down to assumptions. The assumption that when we see people that we know who they are gender-wise, and that if we know their gender, then we can make all these other further assumptions about it. And I think that would be a really helpful way along the line of, rethinking that.
It's part of what I meant by bioessentialist thinking, and biodeterminism. That you are this, your body is this way, and therefore A, B, and C follow everything. All your choices are prescribed for you.
It's been really interesting to me being part of the trans community, because there are so many of us in the community who struggled with accepting how people saw us, which was different from how we saw ourselves, right? And then I enter into a trans community where I get the same kind of experience, because now I'm seen as a man, and people have a bunch of assumptions about what that means. And so then all of the generalizations and assumptions about what man is gets put onto trans men. Many of us who have had very little experience living in the world as a man. And, part of me wants to say, I don't deserve that, right? But I remember as a separatist dyke, my misandry just poured out over the sides of me constantly. So I understand, and I see this as legitimate karma in some ways, right? There's yeah, shovel it on. I shoveled it for years. But what's unfortunate about that is that it creates a lot of separatism within our own community. I think Lee said something about LGBT isn't a word. Well, either is FTM. Because under the umbrella of female to male are so many different identities and ways in which we live our lives, that this sense of, if one is not genderqueer, gender fluid, gender flexible, gender, the F word, I won't say it on the live stream, right? Then there's a problem, you know? This binary identification is a problem. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that assumption is made only on the visual. People look at me, assign binary to me, and treat me as if. So we're, in our own community, we're doing to our brothers and sisters and other siblings what has been done to us. And that is what I'd really like to stop. And I don't know how that impacts non-trans people, but maybe it's in a way of not participating, not supporting, not colluding with that kind of assumption making and identity labeling that goes on in our community. So that those of us who are trying to figure out how to live life as a good man, as a good woman, as a good person, we can do that without having to bump up against our own people who are trying to silence us or convert us to a more, what they consider to be more progressive or revolutionary stance on our gender. Because I've said it before and I'll say it again on TV, which is, I don't know what's more radical than being a transsexual. I mean, quite frankly, it feels like one of the most radical things I've ever done. I literally topsy-turvied something that's an unspoken assumption, which is you're assigned this and you will forever be it. And I was genderqueer as a dyke for 20-something years. I lived in that neutral zone as an androgynous person. I want to do something different now, but I don't want to be penalized for that.
One of the things I think students can do is constantly draw attention to and criticize the way that our society is constantly trying to gender us and reinforce those gender stereotypes. I mean, you can't watch a series of commercials without getting a lot of messages about who we should be and who we should be trying to be, and what the expectations around our sex or gender are. So I think by constantly drawing attention and naming those things, we can begin to raise people's awareness of how it surrounds us, because I think for cisgender people, it's often just invisible. You know, those messages, they've been getting those same messages since we were this high, and that's normal.
Well, then what does it mean, right?
Right.
Like, what does it mean for me? I transitioned medically at 40. So what does it mean for me that for 40 years of my life, or at least say 30 years of that period, I was living with a reinforcement and socialization of femaleness? So as soon as I started, quote unquote, looking or passing or being perceived of as male, did that mean that all of that learning and all of that oppression and marginalization, all those things that happened, am I supposed to forget that? Those things, are they not allowed to bother me anymore? Like, it's how do I unpack all that stuff when I go into a room and it's assumed that I don't know anything about anything that women experience, when I'm like, oh yeah, sure do. You know, I do know exactly what that experience is like firsthand. But I don't have I feel like I don't have a claim to that anymore. Because supposedly I was supposed to leave that all behind. Or if I knew since I was 3 or 4 that I was trans, which isn't my story, then I never get to claim it in the first place, because I was always something else unrealized. It's a very complicated thing, but I always want to tell people, like, I'm living as a man, but I'm trans. That means I was a woman, and those things happen to me that we assume happen to women, and I'm not going to set that aside. I'm not going to set it aside because it's formed who I am as a man. Therefore, I don't want to be labeled that kind of man. And unfortunately, that kind of man doesn't really exist very often either. That's just a notion out there that men are innately evil or bad or harmful. But it gets worked out in our community, because now, I don't know if Lee experiences this, but now I'm in a community of men who used to be lesbians primarily, who bring lesbian feminism into their maleness, and it gets really uncomfortable sometimes, because I'm around a bunch of men who are misandric. Men who don't like men. It's very uncomfortable.
I'm trying to figure that out.
It's very uncomfortable, yeah.
Well, my feeling is, if you're going to put me on a binary of M and F, have a chance to change it from male to female to being fabulous to marvelous. You know, I'll take that. I'll be anywhere from on that spectrum, gladly. I think that it's really important not to make assumptions about any trans person. I think the thing that binds us together are our differences of experiences, our different narratives. And if we look at those narratives, the differences are so rich. There's so much there that, you know, to gloss over them is just, you know, it's remiss. There's a lot in there that we can look at. Especially when we learn about social justice. I mean, how a person who's trans experiences school growing up, how he experiences, you know, family, whatever. There's a lot there, so you gain more by asking that trans person, you know, or that gender queer person, what's your experience? It's really important. Just because you know one trans person, you don't have it all figured out. I don't. You know, and I think that's really, I think that's very important. And it's also important to, in that a lot of trans people, especially if you're going to do work in social justice and pastoral care, is that trans people need to be lifted up to be able to tell their own stories, to be able to own that story, and to not feel shamed in the world about it, that's the story has made them who they are, and that, you know, if you're a person of faith, that, you know, or even if you're not, that you're going to move to a better place, and that's with the help and love of the supportive community to help unpack those gifts that we have. So making assumptions is like you just lock somebody in there. And I think that's really important, especially when we do work around inclusion. You know, really be sure if you're going to be inclusive, you have to ask the hard questions. You know, how do you feel about having trans people in your restrooms? Let's ask the hard questions. Let's talk about all the big elephants in the room that nobody wants to talk about, because these are the things that keep people separate. You know, and we can be exclusive while trying to be inclusive. So you have, you know, okay, trans people are coming in, but we have people who are afraid to use the bathroom now. You know, it's a real thing, and I think we need to be really, you know, have a lot of due diligence when we talk about these things. So especially as students, to ask these questions is important. I'm working with the Trans Task Force at PSR, and we're doing a lot of work around the housing policies, and we're pushing to have them redone, because it's ridiculous. If you're a trans man, when I went there and I wanted to live there, they said, okay, well, you're going to go into a room with, you know, you could be in a room with 2 other cisgender guys, and I'm like, I don't know if that's such a good, I don't know how that's going to work out. Part of me was really scared because I didn't know the community at all, you know. So there's a lot of things there that need to be addressed, and so we're taking all of that on now.
Anyone else have questions? By the way, anyone else think it's cool that Julie invented the word cis for the trans community? I give you credit.
I did not invent it. I will.
It's a science term, right?
It exists in science. It also exists somewhat outside of science. So basically, for people who haven't heard the word cis or you know, basically the cisgender was coined by an activist, a European activist in the 90s. So
You made it pretty popular, though.
yeah, I mean,
I'll give you something.
Well, this is the thing. When I wrote my first book, Whipping Girl, at the time, I had seen it used sporadically on a couple occasions. The first place I saw it was on Emi Koyama has a blog, and that's where I first saw it. And I thought it was really, really useful to get away from, like, you know, biological women and genetic men, and even the word non-trans is like kind of clunky. And but I think I might have been the first book to have used it, and I was like really scared to death about it, because I'm just like, I thought it could make my book completely, people are like, oh, what is this word cis, which people still do, but.
Well, I'm celebrating. Does anybody else have a question? They're slow to have questions, so don't. Thoughtful, they're thinkers.
So my first experience with the transgender dialogue was, I was my first year of college in Alabama, and trying to figure out, as an ally, what my place was within the LGBTQ movement. And we had a book club during intercession term, and the very first book we read was Parrotfish. And I read this book, and I was blown away with the imagery of the parrotfish and how it doesn't have a gender. And for the first time, I could clearly articulate through that book of fiction, oh, I see, how this works, and it makes sense to me, not only logically, but emotionally. There was that divide that was placed up. And I got a call from one of my best friends in high school. It actually first started as a Facebook post that was just to a few of us. And I remember James saying, I will no longer be Kaylee. I am transitioning to James. And I remember this obsession with James that Kaylee had. And she had a whole Yahoo account that was, I love James. And she tried to make it that James was a fictional character that she had created. And it all of a sudden clicked with me as I was reading that book. That was when I got the message. And I picked up the phone and I just said, I want you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry you went through all that pain and the suicide attempts and the anxiety attacks all throughout high school of not being able to express who you were. And I'm wondering, what types of resources like that book would y'all recommend in terms of if we're putting together resources for our community? I don't want the, oh, everything happened really well and all went perfectly. I want really the resources that you all go to in those times that, I don't know, it just seemed like the perfect moment of it being synchronous. I was reading a book at the same exact time. How does, that whole God thing that we talk about here. But yeah, I'm just curious.
Whipping Girl is a really good book.
Yeah, no, that's on the list. I just wanted to make
Which
sure.
one?
Whipping
Oh,
Girl,
yeah.
Letters.
Well, there's, I like this idea of, when people say, oh, being gay is unnatural, right? And so then what that means is you can't find it in nature. Well, of course you can find it in nature. What else can you find in nature, right? So the parrotfish is one example. I read a book, I don't know, it's been almost a decade now, called Rainbow's Evolution, written by a evolutionary biologist. She was a Stanford professor, Dr. Joan Gardner. I'm not sure if she's still at Stanford. And it's multiple species that have very interesting things to do with their sex, basically, like switching. And so I find those kinds of things to be really helpful when people use it's unnatural language. It's like, well, if they live in the Bay Area, if they live in San Francisco specifically, just go on the Valentine's Day tour of the San Francisco Zoo, and you learn all about the kinky lives of the animals, and there's some LGBT stuff going on at the zoo, I'll tell you that right now. So I like the debunking of it's natural. I also, in a very small way, I also want to debunk the idea that all trans people have extremely difficult transitions. Because I don't go to any resources, I'm not going to read any resources about people who struggled in a horrible, horrible way. That's not my story, so I don't connect with it. I personally like reading memoirs. I like reading about people's stories. So for my experience, I read Becoming a Visible Man by Jameson Green, The Testosterone Files by Max Valerio.
Manning Up.
Yeah, okay, sorry. My anthology, Manning Up.
No one likes it when I mention their books.
I know.
It's so funny.
And The First Man-Made Man by Pagan Kennedy, about Michael Dillon, a trans man who transitioned medically in the 1940s, right? So I'm a historian. I like the history part. So I want to read about people's stories. And one of the things that gets missed in a lot of our stories is the trans male story, right? So if you Google transgender history, you're going to get a bunch of links, and very few of them are going to include any trans men at all. So I want to push that. So you might learn about Roberta Cowell from England, but you're not going to read about the trans man who performed one of her surgeries and who was in love with her, and she dissed him because he wasn't a cis man, right? So I love that part. I love the history of our community, and so I point people towards more historical references for reading purposes, and also video. You don't know Dick was the first one I saw, and that was an amazing feature-length movie about trans men. So those are my go-tos: film and books.
I was going to lift up Nature's Rainbow, Joan Roughgarden's first book. I don't know if she has a second book. Was that the one you were talking about?
Oh, I thought it was. Is it Nature's Rainbow?
Nature's Rainbow.
Oh, okay.
First, sorry. And the other one for me that was foundational was Transgender Warriors by Leslie Leinberg, which put gender non-conforming people in a historical context. And I liked the fact that there were both female and males in what we would call FTM and MTS in that book going back. So that's a really important resource for me.
I would say too, agree that the stories are really what helped me, because when I'm with other people, there are certain things that I have to put on, safeguards or whatever, but when I'm home in my room and I'm reading, it's just me and God. And so hearing the stories, I can really, get sometimes to areas that I might not be able to articulate. Like Max Flory, that was the one, he's the lawyer?
No, that's Dylan Kosla.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because when I read that...
Both sides now.
Yes, because when I read that book, I remember there's a part where he talks about going to the lesbian bar, and then all of a sudden he just realized he didn't belong there anymore. And I had that same experience. I was with my ex at that point, who had had a lot of lesbian friends, and we went to one of her friends' birthday parties, and there was all lesbians there, and I just thought, oh my God, I don't belong here. And I like wanted to run out of the room. I just felt so uncomfortable. But it wasn't until, when I read that book, then I was like, that's it, yes, this is it. And that's where I start to find those intersections. And because our experiences are so different, I think the books just really help.
And I have to say I don't relate to that, because I never felt comfortable in male spaces. And the one thing that I was probably most joyous about when I was looking at transitioning was, oh my God, I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to be in those spaces. So that was a relief for me.
And I think the other thing too, if you're going to talk about the male spaces and stuff, the restroom is a challenge. And it's more than just about, well, just go use the men's room. There's cultures in there. And when I went to my gender, therapist, he explained that to me. Like, when you go to the men's room, it's not like the ladies' room where you sit and chat with people, as you're fixing your hair or whatever. You go in, you do your business, and you leave. And I didn't know that. And, that was, sometimes it's a rite of passage to do that. I did it.
Well, there's so many spaces that we navigate, and I've noticed, particularly about the bathroom, something that I've been paying attention to is there's class issues in bathrooms. So when I go into the bathroom at, say, the IHOP or Denny's, I'm in and out, and there's nobody talking. When I've visited bathrooms in more high-end department stores or high-end restaurants, I'm always surprised when the gentleman next to me at the sink starts a conversation, right? Because there's a comfortability for some reason that didn't exist in those other spaces. And I can't remember where I was. I think I was in San Diego. I was in La Jolla. I was walking with Margaret, my wife, and we were lost, and we stopped and asked somebody for directions. And this guy talked in a way that was unfamiliar to me to a certain degree, and we walked away, and it was his response to our question on where's this thing we're looking for. And I said to Margaret, I go, was he gay? And Margaret's like, oh no, he was just affluent. Right? There was a way in which the more affluence you have, the less macho you have to be, because money is more powerful than brute strength. Right? And so in the bathroom with these wealthy men, there's not as much division between us because they don't need to prove themselves. They got affluence. They got power in their workplace. You know, I mean, I might be making this all up, but it's my interpretation of what's going on when I'm going into these different spaces, and I notice that class is one of the things that's so visibly different, because it doesn't matter what their race is, what their age is. I've had conversations with teenagers in bathrooms. It's just really interesting, because I went in with this assumption that, you know, keep your eyes forward, don't talk to anybody. But that only, for me, reinforces how really lonely I feel as a man. I never felt lonely as a woman. I feel much lonelier as a man without the ability to make eye contact with each other and share experiences in public spaces, because maybe homophobia. I'm not really sure why men don't look at each other and have that shared experience that I used to have a lot as a woman. So I feel like when I'm in the bathroom, if I have to just keep my eyes forward and not talk to anybody, it's just reinforcing. So sometimes I just force myself to jump out of my comfort zone and initiate contact with people, even in the bathroom, even if it's just a smile. And people tell me I might get punched one day, but I'd rather be a compassionate patron than, somebody who's afraid, I think I also have to unpack why would I feel afraid around men in a bathroom, which is also what happens, I think, around trans women and cis women who don't want them in the bathroom. I think it's unpacking this sense of men are predators and we can't be safe around them. So I think that gets in the way in these intimate spaces like bathrooms that I notice doesn't happen in all bathrooms. Hasn't happened to me in a church bathroom.
I was struck earlier by your comment about how sometimes when we're trying to be inclusive, we end up also being exclusive because people become uncomfortable or they have to face things that used to be invisible. And as your comment, Xander, actually echoed a comment we heard yesterday, I think from Izzy, about how when we're trying to reach out into these other communities, we need to not just invite people in, but really meet people where they are in their spaces. And I'm curious if there's a connection between those two, because I'd really like to explore if there's an answer to the problem that you posed, Lee, about how do we really make a community where everyone can feel welcome. So just have a conversation about that.
Well, I think in our work to be inclusive, it's important to be mindful. Am I trying to push my agenda down people's throats? Am I trying to force, like, we want to be inclusive, so everybody's got to be on board with this LGBT thing, and so do you understand that there's different groups in there? Do you understand what that's about? And really start going in deeper than just have it be a label. And I think that's really important, especially when you start to talk about trans people. I mean, some people, I know a church in New England that when they started doing their trans work, they had some very deep and painful conversations. Some real stuff was brought up. But now they still have, as a little church in New England, they still have a ladies' circle. And there is a trans woman who is the president of the ladies' circle. So, but that took time. It took time for everybody to be comfortable. It took making a lot of space for people to come and, say, well, maybe you're not feel comfortable talking here, but here's an email address if you have concerns, like when you go home and you want to write about this, feel free to write to me, or I'll be in my office, or I'll be so-and-so, such places you can come and ask me those questions, or just say, I don't know how I feel about, these gender queer people, this doesn't make any sense to me, I'm used to male or female or whatever, just so people have a space that they don't feel like they're being pushed out. That even, that's like you said about meeting them where they're at. So, okay, so what don't you understand? What can we do to help you to understand? I think that's a really good place to start and really opening up the conversation. And like I said, it's usually those things that are uncomfortable that really need to be talked about.
One thing that pops into my head thinking about the inclusivity can also be exclusivity, is the fact that I think one of the problems is when you're a particular marginalized group like trans people are, that you're seen in society as being like special, like you're like the focus is on you because you're the exception. And so as trans people, just like a lot of marginalized groups, we kind of are always responding to the fact that people are reacting to us being trans. And for better or for worse, the way in which a lot of progress is made in activism has been through identity politics, where people say, well, I am a trans person and I deserve to be treated okay. And we petition for inclusivity in society at large by pointing out, hey, you know, we deserve the same rights. And that has been really successful in many different social justice movements. But I think one of the problems that comes with it is that it keeps the focus on us being trans, right? In a way that people are still reacting to the fact that we're trans, but now in this like opposite way. So instead of us being like, oh my God, there's a trans person here, oh my God, that's gross, now they're like, oh my God, there's a trans person here, I have to do and say all the right things, and I hope I don't, you know. And I think part of the problem is we haven't moved the focus off of us. And I think one way that I found that's kind of useful in moving beyond that a little bit is, in when I'm doing activism and speaking to people about trans issues, is trying to say it's not like to move it beyond trans issues and to just talk about like people issues, right? And there are so many different types of overlapping issues. Say, for example, with trans issues, like you could say, you know, one issue that trans people have is, you know, the gatekeeper system where we need like mental health professionals to like approve us if we decide to transition. And that's a trans problem, and I can call that a trans problem, but that's also part of this greater situation where some people in our society are seen as not having autonomy over their own bodies and to make medical decisions for themselves in a way that other people are not. And just like pointing out these double standards to people, you know, if somebody feels that trans people, you know, you've deceived somebody by not telling them that you're trans, say, well, how many times in your life have someone made an assumption about you that wasn't true, and all of a sudden they accuse you of deceiving them? You know, that can happen. And so I think a lot of times breaking them down into human issues, I think can kind of help people be more open to including you in an actually inclusive way, as opposed to, oh, you're a special type of person that now we have to let in here.
Two things. One, I was going to say, I think it's similar to what you were just saying, which is finding the commonality, right? Lots of people have issues with safety. So focusing on the topic of safety rather than people taking positions on this needs to be safe, right? It's just a shift. The other thing is, I think it also has something to do with your idea of taking it off the topic of trans, which is, if I go someplace and they've removed or covered up all of the signs on the bathroom, every single one has been made gender neutral, I don't like that. I want the men's bathroom. Right? That's not inclusive to me. That means I have to go into a bathroom with people I don't want to be in the bathroom with, right? So it's this weird kind of reversal in which it's like, I worked hard to become a man. I want to go in the men's bathroom. So I want to go into a bathroom and not have a situation occur that I don't, it's like I start to feel uncomfortable. So I prefer, like at my work, we have men's room, women's room, and then we have these other bathrooms that are just like unisex, I think they call them. So I liked making options for everybody. That to me feels like an inclusive exclusive. It's like gender neutralizing every bathroom in the building or the facility, some people will feel excluded from those spaces. And yes, they can use them. It's not as if they're barred from using them, but they might like me prefer not to. I know that's probably a small, sort of insignificant thing, but to me, it makes a difference. If I go to a trans conference and the entire convention center has changed all their bathrooms, I'm just like, damn it, I'll just go back to the hotel, you know, because it's, I don't know, there's something about it, you know, I get sort of stuck on the principle of the thing, and, but if I was able to sit down with somebody and have a conversation and people were to talk about like, well, what don't you like about going to that bathroom and what don't you like about going to that bathroom, and we could kind of come to an agreement that everybody wants to use the bathroom where they feel more comfortable, and sometimes that means a separate place and sometimes it means a really inclusive place, then we can create both of those spaces. Because why not? If there are enough options. Right? Because when we were at PSR, we were fighting for the same thing around bathrooms, and somebody pointed out, the bathroom by the chapel is open, the bathroom in the dining hall is open. You can use those bathrooms. Benton Hall, those bathrooms are...
Take showers next to everybody.
Yeah, there's, you know, the only place where there's men's and women's is in the admin building, right? Or in MUD, right? The classroom building. But there are all these other options, so it's like, you know, we tried to get signs put on the bathrooms, and... you know, it didn't happen back in 2002, 3, and 4, but it's because somebody pointed out all those options already exist, and at the time I wanted every bathroom to be available, and over the years I've sort of adjusted because of my own needs to say, okay, so some people can go to the chapel, and some people go to the dining hall, and some people can go to MUD. Everybody has a bathroom, right? Everybody has a bathroom, but that's probably not as common.
To your question, I think that the community can begin to truly approach being inclusive by beginning to do the hard work, asking the hard questions before going to other people. I mean, I've seen too many situations where an organization or a school wants to be inclusive, and so they come be with us, and then they don't change anything about their culture. You know, it's like. Churches that like high worship, but they want to bring the Latinos from the neighborhood and other people of color in, but there's nothing culturally sustaining for them. Mm-hmm. In the same way, trans people moving into a space that it has lots of gender rigidity around roles, access, and things like that, it can be bathrooms, it is difficult, and I think that there's a sort of a failure of responsibility and a sort of hubris about saying, well, we want you here, come in and educate us, and then we'll figure out what we're doing wrong. Do the work, especially, there's so much literature around these things that the communities can begin looking at the ways in which they're reinforcing things and begin, just by stopping with assumptions. Like when new people come in, how would you like to be addressed? What's your preferred gender pronouns? Things like that. If we all got in the habit of doing that, then we'd be chipping away at that sort of bio-essentialist assumptions that we carry around. That's my 2 cents.
Do we have a final question?
I think if you want people to come be in your space, you have to create something that feeds them, and not have minds where they're falling into the things that would keep them out of the space.
And I don't know if it's even realistic to create a space where all people feel welcome. I don't know that exists. And I know I've met people who have tried, and their good idea ends up never sees the light of day because they can't get to that place they want to get because so many people get into the conversation. And well, what about this? And what about these people? And what about this idea? And what about this? And that great idea comes nothing. Nothing comes from it because